Hello, and welcome back to the Bible in Our World Today. Glad you could be with us today. And I trust that you had a great holiday season. We're now into the new year. We're into 2023. I don't know whether you make any determinations about what is going to happen in this next year or what you want to accomplish, but for me, I want to keep doing the videos. I want to keep teaching Sunday school. I just want to keep serving Jesus Christ through 2023 in whatever capacity He calls me to serve in. And I hope that that also is the desire of your heart. Now, last week, we're in Revelation chapter 12. We did an introduction. I've entitled this The Seven Personages of Revelation. Um, all of them, five of them show up in chapter 12, a couple of them in chapter 13. We'll look at that, but primarily we're in chapter 12 and we're going to look at these seven personages and see what God has to say about them. Now, what I want to do, if you have a Bible, I'm going to read, I think I'm going to read 4 verses here. It takes two personages, and we'll see the woman and the red dragon, but I want to read both of those together. So this is what it says in chapter 12, verse 1. And there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. And she being with child, travailing in birth, and pained to be delivered. And there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads, 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his heads. And his tail drew the third part of the stars of heaven, and did cast them to earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, and was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born. Now, we've read here about 2 personages, the woman and the red dragon. I'm going to explain both of them. We're going to look at the woman and see what God has to say. Now, it says here, there was a great wonder or a sign in heaven. Though John is seeing this, from that perspective, the events that take place here in chapter 12 are in fact taking place on planet Earth. This is a great tribulation period. Those things are taking place there. And so we're going to look at it from that perspective. Now, we see the woman. Who is the woman? There have been all kinds of interpretations. I think people like to make Revelation more difficult than it is. And I think one of the things that has happened over the years is that church leadership has really abandoned, if you will, the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation. And consequently, there is, from my perspective, a great lack of knowledge on these 2 books of Scripture. I'm not saying all church leadership has, but I'm saying too much of it has. There's been too much of ignoring what's going on here in the book of Revelation. And I think especially in this day and age, I just believe that we're on the brink of all of this happening. And I think this is something that ought to be in our churches on a regular basis and taught, because I think it is so relevant for what we're seeing today. But getting back to this Revelation, Revelation has been a book that's been sensationalized. People like to sensationalize all of the things they see here. I don't. I take it literally, and I teach it that way. And here, in this passage of Scripture, we see a great sign or great wonder, and it's a woman. And she's clothed with the sun, and the moon's under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. I believe the woman is Israel. That's who we're looking at here. The 12 stars, I believe, are the 12 tribes of Israel that make up Israel as a nation. And the woman, as she represents Israel, I believe is representing a very difficult time in the life of Israel. The tribulation period is going to be one of the most severe times of suffering that the nation of Israel has ever gone through. I don't know, we aren't going there today, we may, for this is done, but if you go back to Zechariah chapter 14, 13, it says that only a third of Israel will survive the tribulation period. The rest will lose their life. It's a terrible, terrible time for Israel. And so we see here a woman and representing Israel with the 12 stars, which represent the 12 tribes. And she is, according to verse 2, she's with child, and she is, it says, travailing in birth and pained to be delivered. This is not the first time that women have been mentioned in Scripture, especially in the book of Revelation. If you go back, and we're not going to turn back there, but I give you the references. In Revelation chapter 2, verse 26, we see a woman by the name of Jezebel found in the 7 churches. She, in that context of chapter 2, represents false religion. In chapter 17, verses 1 through 7 and 15 through 18, we see a harlot mentioned, again a woman, which represents the apostate church during the tribulation period. And then in chapter 19, particularly verse 7, but there's several verses that speak about the marriage supper of the Lamb, where the church, which is the Lamb, Jesus' wife, is presented to him at the marriage supper of the Lamb. A beautiful, beautiful picture of Scripture. We may do that before we get done with all of this. We may go that far through Revelation. I haven't decided how far we're going to go, but we are certainly going to go at least into the bowl judgments, which begin in chapter, I believe, 16. Now, in the Old Testament, Israel is often presented as the wife of Jehovah. Several times it's mentioned in the Old Testament. In these verses, we're going to see there's a godly remnant of Israel, and they're standing true to God. And what we're going to see here in this is this. God said in the Old Testament there would always be a faithful remnant, and there has been. There has been a faithful remnant of Israel throughout the ages. There have always been those who were made up of Israel, were the Jewish men and women that were faithful to worship and to serve Jehovah God. And they had their focus upon a coming Messiah. And so there's always been this faithful remnant. In this passage of Scripture, in chapter 12, we are also going to see there is a faithful remnant of Israel who, during this great time of suffering, is going to be faithful to God. But in this particular picture, the woman represents all of the nation of Israel during this tribulation period. Now, in the Old Testament, and we have here the words the sun and the moon. In the Old Testament, I'm going to give you the references here. I'm not turning back for the sake of time because I want to stay here and focus on this. But in Genesis chapter 37, verses 9 through 11, there's 2 heavenly bodies, the sun and the moon, and they represent, let me get my notes here, Jacob and Rachel. which identify with the woman as being Israel. And in the Old Testament, they fulfill the Abrahamic covenant. And again, stars are mentioned, and as they're mentioned, they represent the 12 tribes of Israel. Now in verse 2, and I'm going to just read this again here. And she being with child cried, travailing in birth, and pained to be delivered. What we see here is the fact that Israel as a nation is in a position where there is about to be a child come out of Israel, which is in fact the Messiah. That's the picture here. And again, we see this woman is in travail. She is pained to be delivered. Not something new for Israel. Israel has always, as I've said in the Old Testament, been pictured as a nation who has really gone through some terrible times throughout her history. In fact, I'm just going to mention a few things here as I look at this. I wrote these down. But look at the nations that have persecuted Israel. Now, true, the pain and the suffering is coming because of the birth of the man-child who is, in fact, the Messiah, Jesus Christ. We'll talk about that more here as we go on. But when we look back at the history of Israel, look at the nations that were, if you will, a problem to her. The Philistines, the Assyrians, 70 years captivity when the Babylonians invaded. And the Syrians that I mentioned, they came in and took the northern kingdom. The southern kingdom that was in the Babylonian captivity, Babylon fell to the Medo-Persians, and they suffered under the Medo-Persians. They suffered under the Grecians. They suffered under Rome. In fact, when this man-child that's mentioned here is born, Israel was under the authority of Rome itself. And then throughout history, there's been the Crusaders, the Spanish Inquisitions that really singled out a lot of the Jewish people. During the Great Dispersion, many, and that was at the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, many of the Jewish people found themselves up in Europe and in Russia. And we know for a fact that the Jewish people suffered greatly in Russia, and there's many still there today that are living in that nation. The Holocaust, Germany, all that the Jews, 6 million Jews lost their life suffering under Hitler and that Nazi regime. Even England at one point stood against Israel. When you stop and think about these nations, and we have to stop and think about them, we have to stop here in this and just at least mention and talk about this. For example, where are those nations today? Where is Pharaoh and his great armies that were going to bring Israel back into the land? They're at the bottom of the Red Sea. They died there. Where's the Babylonians today? Babylon is nothing but a ruins. Saddam Hussein began to rebuild it, but it's certainly not what you would call a city today, and that part of the world is in constant turmoil. The Grecians, Alexander the Great is gone. The Romans today, they're simply mentioned in the history books. They're simply a mention. They are no longer the great Roman Empire that they were. And we go on and list these, For example, and one that sticks into mind that I already mentioned, where is Hitler and the Nazis and their great Nazi regime that brought so much suffering to Israel? Where are they at today? Those nations are gone. Those nations are no longer great entities that they were at one time. But let me ask you this. Where is the woman today and the 12 stars? Where are they at? They are back in the land. They're back in the land. Israel is a nation today. I think that the last numbers I heard, I believe, is something like 8 or 9 million Jews are in Israel right now, and they're coming back every day. There's more coming back into the land. They're surrounded by millions of their enemies, and yet they survive. They're there. They're God's chosen people. Let me say this, folks. There is not anybody else on the face of the earth that is God's chosen people except the woman found in chapter 12, verse 1, Israel. They are the only people. Lift up the United States of America as being a great Christian nation, and no, they go on and on about it. But we are not God's chosen people. We have not been selected by God to be like Israel, chosen. Israel is the apple of God's eye. Israel is God's special people. And as I said a week ago, and I'm going to repeat it again, the church today has not taken the place of Israel. Israel is still God's chosen people. He's not through with them. If you want to see what he's going to do with Israel, read the book of Revelation. Let me say this. If you want a barometer to tell us where we're at prophetically in this world, where we're at according to Scripture, of what God's going to do and what he has planned, look at the nation of Israel. They're the barometer. They're the ones that really dictate by what God's doing in Israel of what he's doing in the entire world. And I just believe by what we see today happening in Israel. Israel's back in the land. That's one of the greatest prophetic events that's ever taken place in our lifetime. 1948, May. And by the way, in May of 1948 is when the United States of America, under that time, the presidency of Donald Trump, made Jerusalem the capital of Israel when we moved our embassy there and recognized them as being the capital of Israel. Israel's back in the land. And I believe she is there to stay, never to leave again. The only thing coming, the rapture of the church, the appearance of the Antichrist, the beginning of the tribulation period, and 7 years of terrible, terrible suffering that is going to take place as Satan rules this world through his man, the Antichrist. That's what awaits for the future. Israel is the barometer to all of that. We just need to keep our eyes on them and what's happening there. Now, if we strictly interpret these two passages of Scripture right here, what we're seeing is Israel is at a point in time where the first coming of Christ is going to happen. Let me read verse 2 again. And she being with child, that is the Messiah, travailed in birth and pained to be delivered. So what we're seeing here is a time period of the first coming of Jesus Christ. Now, I know we're in a tribulation period, but God, in his infinite wisdom and in his sovereignty, has given us a picture here of Israel, the 12 tribes, and a time period when the Messiah is going to be born. That's what we see in verses 1 and 2. Now, we're going to go to verse 3 because it says here, and I'm going to read this again. It says, and there appeared another wonder, another sign in heaven. And again, it says here in heaven, but in actuality, these events are taking place. Jesus, if you go back to verse 2, was not born in heaven. Jesus was born here on planet Earth in a little obscure town called Bethlehem. That's where he was born. And that's what John is seeing. Now, let me just go back here to verse 3. And there appeared another wonder in heaven. And behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns upon his head. This is the second personage, if you will, of Revelation chapter 12. Begins in verse 3, and we'll see more about this red dragon in verse 4. Now, the description given of this personage, if you want person, Satan, he's a living being. He's a living being. He's alive today. In fact, the Bible tells us, be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil walketh about, seeking whom he may devour. His goal is to destroy the Messiah, Jesus Christ. He's tried that, hasn't worked. Now his goal is to destroy the church of Jesus Christ. So Jesus said in the region of Caesarea Philippi, he said, and he told his disciples, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. He will not destroy the church. Jesus will come and rapture the church. Satan will not destroy it. And so we see here, I believe, and by the description of the 10 horns particularly, we're seeing a picture now, not of the birth of Christ, but of the revived Roman Empire, which comes into being under the authority of the Antichrist. And that's a 10-nation confederation, probably made up of European nations. That's what the 10 horns represent. And let me just give you this. Revelation 13:1, you might want to read that. And then Daniel chapter 7, verses 7 and 8, and verse 24, talks about the revived Roman Empire. You might want to just turn and look at those and when the video is over with, to see what God has to say. Now, we also see that this dragon of verse 3 is none other, the red dragon, none other than Satan himself. I've already said that, but I want to emphasize, this is Satan. This is the devil. We could go through Scripture, and there's just many names, names given to him and to the Antichrist. But for this particular study, we'll just call him the devil, Satan, the red dragon. And again, I want to emphasize, don't forget this. This is important as we look at this. This red dragon, this Satan, represents both an empire and a person. Satan represents both. You see, during the tribulation period, there's going to be a one world government. Right now in the world, there is a movement going on to establish a one world government. I think that we're seeing it more every day. We're just seeing incident after incident and decision after decision after decision that's being made today by the people who are in authority in this world to lead the entire world into a one world government. And Satan is going to bring that to fruition through his man, the Antichrist, in the tribulation period. We studied that back here a few months ago as we looked at the one world church and the one world government. And we're just seeing more every day a movement towards that one world government. And as we see that movement towards a one world government, I believe what we're seeing is the ever closer appearing of Jesus Christ in the clouds for the church to remove us from here. But that's what we're seeing, and that's what we're seeing here. In this, when we see Satan, the red dragon, in this picture, we're seeing, I believe, the revived Roman Empire that comes into fruition during the tribulation period. Now it says here that he is, and I underline this in my Bible, it's a red dragon. Why red? Because red indicates the murderous characteristics of this red dragon. The murderous characteristics of this red dragon. Folks, we're not going to get through this. I just looked at the clock. I've run out of time on the video. I thought we would get a little further than this, but we didn't. Next week, we're going to pick up right here with the color red, what that means, and the 7 heads and the 10 horns. We'll look at those things next week as we continue studying the 7 personages of Revelation chapter 12. And again, we'll continue on studying about the red dragon. So glad you could be with us today. Trust that God will richly bless you this week. Boy, I just enjoy this study of Revelation. I hope you are too. I hope it blesses your heart. Hope it's meaningful to you and encourages you. These are, to me, encouraging things because we're seeing what God's going to do. And God is a marvelous God. He's going to do marvelous things. So until next week, we'll pick up right here. Until then, God bless you and thank you so much for being a part of this video series.